The disgraced, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president's campaign is now clearly and brazenly positioning itself as a poison pill to our democracy. Trump making it crystal clear that if he ever finds himself back in the White House, he will use the FBI and the Justice Department as a personal police force to pursue his critics and political enemies. Here's what he said about it in an interview with Univision last night.
It could certainly happen in reverse. It could certainly happen in reverse. What they've done is they've released the genie out of the box. You understand that. They've done something that nobody thought would happen. If I happen to be president and I see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say, go down and indict them. Mostly what that would be, they would be out of business. They'd be out. They'd be out of the election.
It's all out loud now. So out loud that in a statement, a spokesperson for the Trump campaign sought to walk it back and clarify Trump's remarks, saying the ex-president was simply highlighting the dangerous example that President Joe Biden is setting, which only makes sense if you believe Trump's conspiracy theory that 91 felony counts across 4 jurisdictions are the work of Joe Biden and not the end result of years of investigations by independent investigators and prosecutors, some of which have changed hands. Trump's comments are really a reflection of his own deep paranoia and desire to act like an autocrat and his thirst for revenge against people who, in his mind, have wronged him. Washington Post reports this, quote, in private, the former president has told advisors and friends in recent months that he wants the Justice Department to investigate former Trump officials and allies who have become critical of his time in office. That is according to people who have talked to him and spoke anonymously to describe private conversations. As we have reported on this show, the ex-president has a coterie of allies who are drawing up concrete plans that would systematically remove any and all existing guardrails to our country's institutions. On that, the Post reports the plans would, quote, dispense with 50 years of policy and practice intended to shield criminal prosecutions from political considerations. Critics have called such ideas dangerous and unconstitutional. The disgraced ex-president openly running on dismantling the rule of law in America is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. National investigative reporter for the Washington Post, Kara Lenig, is here with us, plus former top Justice Department official, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman's back, and former FBI counterintelligence agent Pete Strzok is here. So I remember where I was, Andrew Weissman, when the Mueller team was looking at Trump's desire to fire Mueller. And I remember it was such a scandal, and it was such a question, and it was such a frenzy because it was this public-facing evidence that he sought to apply pressure on an investigation that may threaten him. Now, his 2024 campaign message is that. I mean, it went from being this thing that he's so normalized with his own base that they barely even registered. A lot of other people shrug and say, well, this is what he's always wanted to do. But at the end of the day, it represents the most brazenly anti-democratic corruption that anyone's ever run for in our country's history.
This is one where it's hard to talk about this without people thinking that you're engaging in hyperbole, because you're not. I remember that too, Nicole. I remember being on the special counsel Mueller's team, and I remember an interview that was done with Senators Murkowski and Collins, where they said to the journalist, it doesn't work that way. You don't get to choose your prosecutor. And just think how far we've come from that, where there aren't people in Congress who are willing to really stand up on the Republican side or independents and speak for democracy. But you really have the former president saying that he is going to continue to do what he did, but he is taking additional steps. So, we're on a panel with Pete Strzok, who we hardly need to talk about the former president just thinking about going against people who he disagrees with, or he views as a threat, or should seek to hold him to account. Pete is a living exhibit to that, but so are many others who have been the subject of his vitriol and worse. And he, as you said, is going to do it with respect to attacking the whole idea of civil servants in the Justice Department, of not having people who are insufficiently loyal, where he's now including people like Pat Cipollone and Don McGahn and even Bill Barr, for Christ's sake, saying that's not even loyal enough to him. And he has also spoken about using the pardon power to pardon people like everyone in January 6th insurrection, so that you have a complete undermining of the rule of law with that combination of powers that are in the hands of the executive when they are not wielded responsibly.
I don't like to point this out, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to. What he's done to you, Pete, and he had Jim Comey and Andy McCabe and Vindman and Whistle. I mean, he's targeted and encouraged prosecutions, in some cases successfully, into a lot of people that threatened him because of his perception that the rule of law would harm him in some way. And this is the part that I'm reluctant to share, but I'm going to do it. It's working. This is from NBC's reporting. In March of 2023, the Pew Research Center found that just 38% of Republicans and Republican-leaning adults had a favorable view of the FBI. 53% had an unfavorable view of the Bureau. Mind you, it's been led by Christopher Wray, who Trump handpicked after Republican Chris Christie recommended him. Back to the NBC reporting, that is a significant rapid shift among Republican voters over just a few years of the Trump era. In 2018, 49% of those Republicans and Republican-leaning adults viewed the FBI favorably, and 44% viewed it unfavorably. Back in January of 2017, just before Trump took office, 65% of Republicans had a favorable view of the FBI, 21% had an unfavorable view, and in 2010, 71% of Republicans had a favorable view of the FBI. Can the FBI do what it needs to do and do so safely if only 38% of Republicans in this country have confidence in it, Pete?
Well, I think the FBI is going to do what it needs to do. The question is, what is the impact on morale? What is the impact on the ability of those agents and investigators and prosecutors to do their job? I mean, look, I was struck earlier this week, Carol was on with you, and she talked about all the bodies on the floor following Crossfire Hurricane. And as I listened to Trump talking about not only going after his political enemies, but potentially looking at the J and FBI, I can't help but think about, friends of mine, colleagues of mine, some who still are in the FBI, who have legal teams, who have massive legal bills because of this huge apparatus. It's not just Trump. Remember, the same congressional enablers now who are fighting to impeach Joe Biden and to, put gum up the works with anything being criminally done with Trump are the same people working with him to attack the FBI and DOJ. And you add in certain right-wing media who adds to that chorus. That's the reason why we have such negative public perception. So, of course, the FBI is going to keep doing their job, but it absolutely takes a toll. People on the inside are well aware of what happens when you engage in an investigation that implicates Trump, and that carries a cost. And I hate to say it, it does have an impact on the morale within the organization. It doesn't stop people from doing their job, but it certainly makes it a far, far more difficult place to go in and do your job.
It also, Pete, the attacks land on an agency very much like the military that doesn't have an ounce of sort of political rapid response in their DNA, right? So when Tucker Carlson's smearing the military up and down, right and left, they don't have the ability to go on Fox and defend themselves. The FBI seems similarly hamstrung by design and by culture to defend itself. Even with that, and if you disagree, please tell me, but is there more that can be done to bolster the integrity of the agency, specifically as it's been led by Trump's handpicked director?
Well, first of all, I think you're exactly right. I mean, the notion of the sort of ethos of the FBI ethically is that we don't take political sides, that you don't talk about investigations that aren't public, that you speak through your charging documents. So when it comes to somebody making obscene, absurd allegations that, well, this is an unmerited investigation, the FBI simply can't go and say, well, here are all the facts that we have at our possession, at our fingertips, to explain why we go out and we're doing an investigation. That's just simply not the way the justice system works. So in some ways, the ability to engage in sort of push back on some of these false narratives is extraordinarily limited just by the way that the FBI is designed not to make public information that should not be made public. Now, when it comes to how you do push back, I mean, this is something I am glad to see Director Wray recently leaning forward a little bit in his most recent congressional testimony over the past several months, defending the FBI, talking about the work. But it really falls to people outside of the FBI and DOJ to rise to make a more spirited defense. Because as you point out, again, the system is not designed to allow the FBI and DOJ to do that. Again, A.G. Garland, I think, can and has done some of that. I'd like to hear more of it from the senior leadership at DOJ and the FBI. But no question about it, this is a very difficult time to be working in this context.